I flew 400,000 miles a year, and I could not find my way home to my own son. Then a woman missed her connecting flight because of me and spent the next 11 hours teaching me the one thing 30,000 feet had never taught her. Before I tell you how a stranger stranded in an airport changed the entire direction of my life and how my little boy is the reason I finally landed, do me one favor. If you believe that sometimes you have to be grounded before you can truly arrive, then hit that subscribe button right now, because this story taxis through some turbulence before it touches down. Stay with me. My name is Caleb Turner. I'm 40 years old. I wear the uniform well, they tell me, and I've been a pilot my whole adult life. I flew for the military first and then for the airlines, and I made Captain Young, and I was by every measure the world uses a success. 4 stripes on my sleeve, the left seat of a wide-body jet. I flew the long-haul international routes, the glamorous ones, the ones that take you to cities on the other side of the planet. And I was gone on average 20 days a month. I was very good at flying airplanes. It was the only place I ever felt completely in control. 35,000 feet, a machine that did exactly what I told it, a checklist for every problem, a procedure for every emergency. Up there, nothing was uncertain. Up there, I always knew exactly where I was and exactly where I was going. It was the ground I could never get right. I had a son. Have a son. His name is Theo, and he was 6 the year this story happens, and he was at that point being raised mostly by my mother because I was never home. His own mother, my ex-wife, Vanessa, had left when Theo was 2, not a dramatic leaving, just a slow, honest recognition that she'd married a man who was never there and didn't want to raise a child, essentially alone. And she wasn't wrong, and we divorced without war, and she moved on and stayed a distant but decent mother from another city. And custody fell to me, which sounds noble, until you understand that a long-haul captain who's gone 20 days a month doesn't really have custody of anything. He has a mother who has custody and a son who has a grandmother and a father who arrives like weather occasionally and leaves again. I told myself I was providing. That's the story every absent father tells, and I told it in a pilot's uniform. I made good money and I sent it home, and Theo had everything, the good school, the nice house, my mother's endless love. And I told myself that was fatherhood, that the flying was for him, that I was building him a life. And it took a 6-year-old and a stranger in an airport to show me that I'd built my son a life with a hole in the middle of it, exactly the shape of me. Here's what my son did. Theo at 6 started drawing airplanes, constantly. My mother thought it was sweet, thought he was proud of his pilot dad, and she'd send me the pictures. And it was only later that I really looked at them and understood. In every single drawing there was an airplane in the sky and a little boy on the ground looking up at it, never in it. Always on the ground looking up. My son didn't draw himself flying with me. He drew himself watching me leave. Every picture was the same picture, a plane in the air and a boy underneath it getting smaller. He was 6 and he'd already understood his whole relationship with his father, and he drew it over and over, the way kids draw the truth they can't say. I was the airplane. He was the boy on the ground, and I was always going away. I want to tell you about the goodbyes because they're the thing I'd trade anything to have back. Every time I left for a rotation, Theo had a ritual. He'd stand at the front window and watch me put my bag in the car, and he'd press his hand flat against the glass, and I'd press mine against the other side, and then I'd drive away. And my mother told me, though, I made her stop telling me because I couldn't bear it, that he'd keep his hand on the glass long after the car was gone, sometimes for 10 minutes, watching an empty driveway. I have taken off in weather that would frighten most people. I have landed a full aircraft with a failed system and a calm voice, and I could not for years make myself feel the thing I should have felt about a 6-year-old with his hand pressed against a window, watching my taillights disappear, because feeling it would have meant I had to change, and changing meant giving up the one place I felt safe. So I flew, and he pressed his hand to the glass, and I called it providing. But I didn't understand that yet on the day this story really begins. Because on that day, I was just a captain, running a little behind, a bit impatient, focused on my numbers, when a gate agent made a decision that changed my life, and I didn't even know it was happening. There was weather. A big system, the kind that cascades delays across a whole continent. My inbound was late, which made my outbound late, and there was a woman, a passenger, who had a tight connection, and my delay was going to make her miss it. Her name was Meredith, and she was trying to get across the country for something that mattered, and my flight's delay meant she was going to miss her connection by 15 minutes and be stuck overnight in a connecting city where she knew no one, and she was understandably upset about it at the gate. And I happened to be walking through in my uniform, and she recognized me as the captain of the flight that had ruined her evening, and she said, not cruelly but with real frustration, "You people, you act like the only thing that matters is the plane. Do you ever think about the fact that every one of these delays is somebody's actual life, somebody who needed to be somewhere?" I get that a lot, the you people, the frustration, and usually I let it slide off because weather isn't my fault, and a captain learns not to absorb every stranded passenger's anger. But something about how she said it, somebody who needed to be somewhere, landed differently that day. Maybe because my mother had just sent me another drawing, another plane, another boy on the ground. So instead of giving her the professional non-answer, I stopped, and I said, "You're right, I'm sorry, where do you need to be?" And Meredith Cole, surprised that I'd stopped, told me. She was flying to see her father, who was in the hospital, who was not doing well, and she'd been putting off the visit for months because they were estranged, a long story, an old wound, and she'd finally decided to go and make it right while there was still time, and now the weather and my delay were going to cost her a night, and every night mattered now, and she was terrified she'd left it too late, that she'd spent so long being angry at her father that she'd missed the window to stop being angry before he was gone. And I did something a captain does not do. I sat down with her. In the terminal, both of us stranded by the same weather, and I listened, and we ended up talking for the whole 11 hours it took for the weather to clear, and in those 11 hours a stranded stranger taught me the thing that 30,000 feet never had. Because Meredith, it turned out, was like me. She'd spent her life running. Not in airplanes, but running all the same, a big career. A life of constant motion, always the next thing, always somewhere to be, and she'd used all that motion, she realized out loud, sitting in a plastic airport chair to avoid the one place she was afraid to land, which was her own father's house, her own unfinished business, her own heart. "I've been to 60 countries, she told me, and I couldn't drive 40 minutes to my dad's house for 11 years, because the countries were easy and my father was hard. Motion is how people like us hide. As long as you're moving, you never have to arrive anywhere that might actually cost you something. Motion is how people like us hide." She said it about herself, but she was describing me exactly, and she saw me hear it, saw it land, and she said, "You've got that look. Who are you running from at 35,000 feet, Captain?" And I told her about Theo, about the drawings I was only just beginning to understand, about the plane in the sky and the boy on the ground getting smaller. And I said the thing I'd never said out loud to anyone. I think I fly because up there I'm in control, and down there with my son I have no idea what I'm doing, and I'm scared of it. So I keep leaving. I keep choosing the thing I'm good at over the thing I'm scared of, and I've been calling it providing. And Meredith Cole looked at me and said, "Your son doesn't need a provider. He needs you to land. Trust me, I'm about to fly across the country because I finally figured that out about my own father, and I might be too late. Don't be me. You've still got time. Land the plane, Caleb. Land it and stay landed." I learned about Meredith over those 11 hours the way you can only learn about someone when you're both stranded and neither of you expects to see the other again, which strips away all the performance. She was a consultant, flew constantly, the kind of person whose whole identity was in the frequent flyer status and the hotel points and the sense of being needed somewhere important at all times. And she told me that the estrangement from her father had started over something that from a distance seemed almost small. A thing he'd said at her mother's funeral years back. A cold, clumsy thing, and how she'd let that one moment calcify into 11 years of not speaking, because it was easier to be righteously wounded than to do the hard, humbling work of going home and forgiving an imperfect man. The distance was never really about what he said, she told me somewhere around hour 7 when the honesty gets easy. The distance was a decision I kept making every day by not driving over there. Estrangement isn't a state, Caleb. It's a verb. You have to keep doing it. Every day you don't call is a day you chose it again. And I thought about my son's window, and my hand on the glass, and how I'd been choosing the distance every single day, too, in a uniform and calling it a career. She asked me at one point what I was afraid would happen if I stopped flying so much and stayed home. And I didn't have a clean answer, and she waited the way people do when they know the real answer is coming, and finally I said it. I'm afraid I'll be bad at it. In the cockpit, I'm the best there is. On the ground with my son, I'm a beginner, and I'm 40, and I don't know how to be a beginner anymore, and I'd rather be a great pilot than a mediocre father, so I keep choosing the thing I'm already good at. And Meredith looked at me with something like recognition and something like grief, and she said, "That's the saddest, most honest thing anyone said to me in years, and it's exactly backwards. Nobody's tombstone says he was great at the thing he was already good at. Be a beginner. Be a bad father who's there over a great pilot who isn't. Your son will take the beginner, I promise you." I would have taken 11 more years of a clumsy present father over the perfect distant memory I'm flying across the country to say goodbye to. But I have to tell you what almost happened, because a happy ending you didn't have to change your whole life for isn't worth telling. I didn't change right away. That's the honest part. That night in the airport cracked something open, but I was a 40-year-old man with a whole identity built on 4 stripes and a wide-body jet, and you don't rebuild that overnight. I flew Meredith's flight out the next morning, and I wished her well, and I told her I hoped she made it in time, and I went back to my life, the 20 days a month, the long hauls, the boy on the ground getting smaller. For a few months, nothing changed. I told myself the airport had been a nice conversation, a moment, nothing more. I was very good at not landing. And then 2 things happened close together. The first was a letter. Meredith wrote to me, care of the airline, a real letter to tell me that she'd made it, that she'd gotten to her father's bedside with a few weeks to spare, and that they'd used those weeks, and that she'd been there holding his hand when he died, and that she would spend the rest of her life grateful she hadn't waited 1 flight longer. And she wrote at the end, "I hope you landed. I think about your son on the ground in those drawings. Don't make him keep drawing that picture. You can give him a different one to draw, but only if you're actually in it." And the second thing, the thing that finally did it, happened a week after that letter. I came home from a 10-day rotation, and Theo was asleep, and my mother was tired, more tired than I'd let myself notice getting older, and I went to look in on my sleeping son, and on his nightstand was a new drawing. And it was the same drawing, the plane in the sky. The boy on the ground. Except this time my 6-year-old had written words on it, was learning to write, and under the boy, on the ground, he had written in the painstaking letters of a child, "Me waiting." And under the airplane, he had written, "Dad." Me waiting, Dad. That was the whole caption of my son's life. Me waiting, Dad leaving. I stood in the dark of my son's room holding that drawing, and I finally understood that I was going to lose him the way Meredith almost lost her father. Not to death, but to distance, to all the years I kept choosing the sky, and that one day he'd be grown, and I'd want to land, and there'd be no runway left. Just a man who'd become weather to his own child, occasional and impersonal, someone you plan around, not someone you count on. And I made the decision that a younger version of me would have called insane. I grounded myself. And I want you to understand what that meant to a man like me, because it wasn't a small thing dressed up as a big one. My whole identity was in those 4 stripes, and that left seat, and the wide-body jet, and the international routes that only the senior captains fly. It was what I'd worked toward my entire adult life, from the military to the airlines, decades of it. Colleagues thought I'd lost my mind. My chief pilot asked me twice if I was having some kind of crisis, if I needed to talk to someone, because pilots don't voluntarily give up the seniority they've bled for. I gave up the long-haul international routes, the glamorous ones, the 400,000 miles a year. I took a demotion, effectively transferred to short domestic routes, the unglamorous puddle jumpers' day trips home every single night. My income dropped by more than half. I sold the second car and the boat I never used, and I did not care, because I finally understood the arithmetic Meredith had drawn for me in a plastic airport chair. I could spend the next 10 years being an important man my son barely knew, or I could spend them being an ordinary man my son could count on, and only one of those was worth anything, and I'd wasted 6 years choosing wrong. I made a fraction of the money, and I told my mother she could finally rest, and I moved back into the daily life of my own son, the school pickups and the dinners and the bedtimes, and the ordinary, unglamorous, ground-level business of being somebody's actual father. And it was hard. Meredith was right that I didn't know how to do it. The first months were awkward, my son and I circling each other like strangers, because that's what we were, and I had to learn him from scratch, had to earn a place in a life that had learned to work without me. I'll give you the worst of it, so you don't think it was easy. About a month in, I tried to put Theo to bed, tried to do the whole routine, and I got it all wrong. The wrong book, the wrong order, the wrong voice, because I didn't know his routine my mother did, and Theo got frustrated and finally said, not even angry, just matter of fact in a way that cut deeper than anger. "Grandma does it better. You don't know how." And he was right. I didn't know how. A captain who could recite an emergency checklist from memory couldn't put his own son to bed. And instead of retreating to the sky the way every instinct screamed at me to, I did the thing Meredith taught me. I said, "You're right, buddy. I don't know how yet. Will you teach me? You're the only one who knows how you like it." And my 6-year-old, suspicious at first, taught me which book, which order, the specific way he liked the blanket. And it took weeks of him teaching me, of me being a humble beginner at the bedtime of my own child, before I got it right. And the night I finally got it right, all of it, without being corrected once, Theo looked up at me and said, "You know how now?" 4 words. But it was the first time my son looked at me like I belonged in the room. I had landed 100 aircraft. Getting the blanket right was harder, and it mattered more. But here's what happened. Slowly, Theo stopped drawing that picture. It took a while. But one day my mother handed me a new drawing, and I braced myself for the plane and the boy on the ground, and instead it was a picture of 2 people, a big one and a small one, standing next to each other on the ground, and there was a little airplane in it too, but it was small off in the corner, not the center of anything, and the 2 people on the ground were holding hands. My son had drawn a different picture. He'd drawn me in it, on the ground, with him. It had taken me 40 years and a stranger in an airport and a letter from a hospital and a caption that said, "Me waiting," to give my son a new picture to draw, but he drew it the moment I gave him a reason to. And Meredith and I had kept writing after that first letter, and the writing turned into calls, and the calls turned into her flying out to meet me on one of my new short domestic layovers. And it turned out that a woman who'd finally learned to land and a man who'd finally learned to land had a great deal to say to each other on the ground. She'd changed her own life after her father died, pulled back from the constant motion, and we found each other in the same place, 2 people who'd spent their lives running and had both within a year decided to stop. She met Theo, and she was careful with him, and she understood better than anyone what it had cost him to have a father in the sky. Because she'd been the daughter of an absence too, and she never once tried to be his mother. She just tried to be one more person who stayed on the ground with him. The first time Meredith visited, she was nervous in a way I'd never seen in the composed woman from the airport, because she knew what Theo had been through, and she was terrified of being one more adult who blew into his life and back out again, one more plane in his sky. So she did something I've never forgotten. She didn't try to win him over with gifts or games. She asked him to show her his drawings. And Theo, who was cautious with strangers, got out his whole stack years of them, and he walked her through them, and when he got to the ones of the plane and the boy on the ground, Meredith didn't flinch or get falsely cheerful. She just looked at them for a long time and said, "You drew exactly how it felt. That's really brave to draw the true thing, even when it's sad. I used to feel like that about my dad." And Theo looked up at her, this 8-year-old, and recognized a fellow member of the club. Nobody wants to join the kids who watched a parent leave, and something between them settled right there over a stack of sad drawings, honestly with no pretending. She never once tried to be his mother. She was something rare and exactly right. She was proof that the leaving could stop for both of them. And Theo, who drew everything, drew her into the picture too eventually. 3 people on the ground now, holding hands, the plane small in the corner. We were married 2 years later, and Theo, 8 by then, was my best man. And he gave a speech, and in it he said the thing that undid the whole room. He said, "My dad used to be an airplane. Now he's a dad. I like him way better as a dad." And he sat down, having summarized my entire transformation in 14 words. The way children do, cutting straight to the bone of a thing the adults would take a paragraph to miss. My mother cried through the whole ceremony, and afterward she took my hands the way she had when I was a boy, and she said, "You gave me back my grandson's father, and you gave me back my own rest. I was so tired, Caleb. I never told you how tired because you were providing, and I didn't want to be ungrateful. But that little boy needed you, not the money, and I couldn't be you no matter how much I loved him." And I understood that my absence hadn't just cost my son. It had quietly cost my mother years of exhaustion. She'd never once complained about carrying a load that was mine so that I could fly. Landing didn't only bring me home to Theo. It let an old woman finally set down a weight she'd been carrying alone. I still fly. I want to be clear about that because people think this is a story about giving up your dreams, and it isn't. I love flying, and I still do it the short routes home every night, and I'm good at it, and my son is proud of it in a healthy way, now not the anxious way. But I fly to live now, instead of living to fly. The plane got small in the corner of the picture where it belongs, and my son got big in the center where he always should have been. Meredith says the whole trick of a life is figuring out what belongs in the center and what belongs in the corner, and that most people like us spend years with it, backwards, the career in the center and the people in the corner, and that you're lucky if something knocks it right before it's too late. A stranded flight knocked it right for me. A dying father knocked it right for her. My son had been trying to knock it right for years, one drawing at a time, and I just hadn't been on the ground long enough to see them. Theo is 11 now. He still draws, and he's good, really good, and you know what he draws. Not airplanes mostly. He draws people, families, groups of people on the ground together. His teacher says he has a gift for it, for drawing people in relationship, for capturing who's connected to who. And I think about how my son spent his early years drawing a boy alone on the ground, looking up at a plane, and how he spends them now, drawing people together, and I understand that children draw their world, and that I changed his world barely in time, and that the proof is in the crayon. Meredith framed the two drawings and hung them side by side in the hall. The old one and the new one, the boy alone and the family together. And she says they're the before and after of our whole family, and she's right. And I can't walk past them without stopping. If you made it all the way here, then you already know this was never really a story about flying. It was a story about motion, about the way we use being busy and being important and being somewhere else to avoid the places that might actually cost us something, and about how the people who love us are drawing us pictures of the truth all along if we'd only land long enough to look. So before you go, do this one thing for me. If there is someone in your life who's been waiting on the ground for you to land, or someone who taught you to land when you'd forgotten how, put their name in the comments. Just the name. Let them know for 1 second in a place they'll never see that you finally see the picture. And if this story reached you, subscribe and stay with me, because I have more of them. True ones, hard ones, stories about the things we chase and the people we leave on the ground and the strangers and the children who finally teach us to come home. This was the last of 10. And if you've been with me through all of them, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Every one of these stories was about the same thing in the end. A person too scared or too proud or too busy to let love land, and the people brave enough and stubborn enough to bring them down safely anyway. Because that, it turns out, is the only trip that was ever worth taking. Not the one that takes you away. The one that finally brings you home.